Sup, chooms, how y'all living? Hope everything is Nova and you're all having a preem week. So today, we're going to go over a video I saw recently from a gentleman who goes by the name of Mike the Vegan titled, quote, 4 plant-based hair loss treatments backed by science, unquote. So as the name would imply, he is a vegan YouTuber, and specifically he is an ethical vegan who makes a lot of science-based videos that promote the vegan lifestyle as well as debunk common misconceptions about veganism. Being a proud vegan soy boy myself, I am of course all for this, and being that Mike the Vegan has a large audience, I think there is no doubt that he has likely saved the lives of many animals, so I definitely respect the man and what he does on YouTube. So when I saw he made a video about hair loss, I was especially interested in seeing what his take on this subject from a vegan point of view would be. Now, even though I am a vegan myself and I think that a properly planned vegan diet can absolutely be a good component of an overall healthy lifestyle, I am always very careful not to oversell the benefits of veganism so as to not convince people to go vegan based on false pretenses. Being that I am an ethical vegan, there's always a temptation to say anything I can to convince other people to go vegan on the premise that it will save more animal lives. The problem with this mindset, though, is that if you convince people to go vegan based on exaggerated claims of vegan health benefits, then in the end it is going to backfire, since even though you may be convincing more people to go vegan, you're convincing them for the wrong reasons, and nobody's going to want to stick with a lifestyle that they got tricked into for duplicitous reasons. So, when people ask me about veganism, I give them the harsh truth about it and don't sugarcoat anything. The fact of the matter is that veganism is not easy. It is inconvenient, it can cause social strife amongst your meat-eating family and friends, and you have to carefully plan your diet to make sure you are not malnourishing yourself. I've been vegan for nearly 20 years, and at no point has it been easy for me, but I would still never quit veganism because ultimately it isn't about me, it is about the animals. When vegans get into the subject of health and nutrition, they're really opening up a can of worms because diets in general are like cults, especially on social media where people will have a religious zeal for whatever fad diet they subscribe to. So even though I believe that a vegan lifestyle has benefited my own health, I do not think the focus of veganism should be on health, but rather it should be about ethics and how animal rights should be seen as an extension of human rights. Having said that though, the purpose of this video is not about my own reasons for being vegan, but rather about how vegans like Mike the Vegan can sometimes oversell the benefits of veganism, which may be well-intentioned, but in the end it sends the wrong message about what veganism should be about. At least for me, veganism is not about the health of humans. Instead, it is about the health of animals. I believe that the lives of animals are important enough to me that I am willing to sacrifice some inconveniences to help promote their well-being. Considering the diabolical cruelty that animals endure on a daily basis, it is the least I can do for them, and for that reason, I would never try to encourage anyone to go vegan unless they too were prepared to leave their safe space and make some sacrifices to their comfort. Veganism to me is all about the animals, so if someone doesn't care about the animals, they shouldn't be going vegan to begin with. I think Mike the Vegan also cares about the animals, but he strikes me as someone who is so passionate about promoting veganism that he will sometimes accept any possible claims that put veganism in a good light. So if he sees something that is plant-based or vegan that claims to have some sort of therapeutic benefit, he'll promote it without analyzing it too critically. And this is not because he's scientifically illiterate or anything. I mean, on the contrary, I think he does a great job of debunking anti-vegan pseudoscience as well. For example, his videos debunking ridiculous fad diets like the blood type diet, as well as him dismantling all the nonsense health claims about bone broth are absolutely fantastic, and I highly recommend you watch them. But I think he is pretty selective in what information he chooses to disseminate based on a bias towards veganism, just as some people are biased against veganism. So, since the purpose of my channel is to be as fact-based and science-based as possible, let's see if I can set aside my own biases towards veganism for a moment and analyze what Mike has to say about hair loss and veganism as objectively as possible. So, let's get into the actual video and look at what he has to say about these treatments he's promoting for hair loss and see if they really are backed by science as he claims they are.
Start by saying I'm lucky to still have my hair. I have really messy hair so that people no longer constantly say that I have a wig because my hair doesn't match my beard. No wig would be this messy, so nobody can be tricked now.
So he starts off by talking about his own hair, and I would agree, it looks pretty good. I think Mike is in his 30s, so if he does have the androgenic alopecia gene, then it is pretty mild.
And when my dad went bald young, my mom's dad, the one you get it from, kind of slowly lost his hair until 60.
He then mentions his own family history of hair loss by bringing up his mom's father, and then erroneously states that this is where men inherit the androgenic alopecia gene. This is a very common old wives' tale, and is one that many people erroneously believe in, so I don't think Mike is being deceptive here. Rather, I think he was just misinformed about this. The truth is, though, is that you can inherit the androgenic alopecia gene from either your mother or your father's side of the family, and if both of them have it, then your chances of getting it are greater than if just one side has it. He's definitely right, though, that hair loss is predominantly a genetic trait, but he's wrong in thinking that we inherit it solely from our mother's side of the family, but no big deal. I just felt I'd go ahead and provide that quick correction for Mike.
So, like, what's a safe, natural thing I can do to maybe slow any natural hair loss that might occur for me as I age, and with most people as they age? Because there is going to come a day where I probably will be visibly more bald on camera here.
So obviously, I can fully understand Mike wanting to take preventative measures to stop his own hair loss. This is the responsible thing for him to do. But at the same time, I have to wonder why he is so fixated on the notion that his preventative measures for fighting hair loss must be grounded in natural treatments, especially since he has a very science-oriented YouTube channel, and he should know that using nature as a metric to determine the quality of something is an obvious fallacy. He should especially know this since he's a vegan, and people who are against veganism use appeal to nature fallacies to argue against veganism in virtually all of their arguments. Just a few examples, for instance. We shouldn't be vegan because we evolved to eat meat. Our ancestors ate meat and we needed meat to make our brains grow. We have sharp canine teeth, which means we were designed to eat meat. I didn't get to the top of the food chain just to eat plants. You can't go vegan without supplementing B12, and therefore veganism is bad because supplements aren't natural. And I can go on and on. But the point is that it's borderline paradoxical for a vegan to use an appeal to nature fallacy when vegans have to deal with this kind of logical fallacy crap all the damn time. There are instances where you can fight nature with nature, such as fighting fire with water, but in the case of androgenic alopecia, there is no proven effective natural approach towards tackling it. So long as something is safe and effective, then why should it matter if it's natural? Nature is completely indifferent when it comes to determining outcomes of treatments, so Mike really shouldn't consider nature to be an important factor when choosing a treatment for his own hair loss journey. I think Mike probably knows this, but being that he is a vegan activist, he probably sees some appeal in presenting something as natural, since there are a lot of appeal to nature morons even within the vegan community. But if you really think nature is always good for you, then try getting struck by a lightning bolt if you want to see just how little of a damn Mother Nature cares about you. Or just consider the lightning bolt of androgenic alopecia that nature has struck so many of us with. Androgenic alopecia is natural, so don't tell me how great nature is when nature is what's causing us to go bald to begin with. Our progress as a human species has always been contingent on conquering nature, not acquiescing to it. We didn't eliminate smallpox, invent the computer, or fly to the moon by turning to the ancestral wisdom of our forebears. We did so by turning to science, and it is science that will further help us progress as a species by conquering climate change, curing diseases, extending the life of humans, as well as traversing the stars, and of course, fighting androgenic alopecia as well. Those who wish to be left behind in nature's primordial sludge will not reap any of the benefits science has given us, so with all due respect to Mike the Vegan, fuck nature.
Will I lose all my followers then? I hope not, but will everybody blame it on a vegan diet? Yes.
I like what he says here because that is so true. When you are a vegan, anything bad that happens to you at all will cause everyone around you to blame it on veganism. If I show up to work and I have a cold, it will cause everyone to instantly play doctor and be like, see, that wouldn't have happened to you if you weren't a vegan. And Mike is absolutely right. When vegans go bald, people will always assume it must be because of their diet. But if non-vegans go bald, nobody will even question their diet most of the time. People will blame all sorts of things on veganism. Like, for example, you have people like Joe Rogan, who if there is some vegan athlete who underperforms, he will instantly blame it on veganism, but if the same thing happens to a non-vegan, he will never have any question about their diet. The fact of the matter is that food is a series of components that are necessary for human physiology. These components include things like fats, proteins, carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals, and water. There are ways to get sufficient amounts of all these components regardless of whether or not they include animal products. If somebody is malnourished, it isn't necessarily the fault of veganism because it is possible to be malnourished malnourished on a non-vegan diet as well. If people want to claim that a vegan diet cannot possibly meet the physiological requirements for a human being who leads a physically active lifestyle, then the burden of proof is on them. Somebody failing on a vegan diet doesn't disprove veganism any more than someone failing on an omnivorous diet disproves omnivorism. Bad diets are bad diets, whether the nutrition is derived from plants or from animals, and just because someone can't figure out how to eat plants and be healthy doesn't mean plants are unhealthy. There are likely some examples of people who lose hair due to severe malnourishment after following a poorly planned vegan diet, just as there are examples of people losing hair from malnourishment following a non-vegan diet. You don't hear anyone bring up the latter example though, because non-vegans love finding any excuse they possibly can to bash veganism, because this is a coping mechanism to help them deal with their deep-rooted insecurities and shame that they feel about their addiction to the taste of meat. If they didn't feel shame, they wouldn't get so defensive about it every time a vegan invades their safe space by daring to bring up the unfathomable cruelty animals endure on a daily basis. As a vegan, I can understand why meat eaters find our lifestyle unappealing and why they lash out against vegans. I know many non-vegans are worried about how it will affect them personally if veganism becomes mainstream. Non-vegans claim they only dislike it when vegans shove veganism down their throat, but the truth is, just the existence of vegans is offensive to them, and that is why so many non-vegans will use every chance they get to bash vegans, no matter how illogical it is. I don't believe in shoving veganism down people's throats either, but for every one pushy vegan, I see 10 times as many pushy meat eaters who brag about how much meat they eat whenever someone posts something about liking tofu or being upset about animal cruelty, so it's not like the pushiness doesn't go both ways. But this is not really the focus of this video, but I still want to elaborate on this point Mike makes because it is a pet peeve of a lot of vegans, but let's go ahead and move on.
First, it would really help if we just touch on the mechanisms of how things work, especially with androgenic alopecia, the most common alopecia for men.
Yes, that is correct, that androgenic alopecia is the most common type of alopecia. You don't need to be a medical editor or a scalp massage therapist to know that.
And we still need to acknowledge the other causes of hair loss as well, and there are a ton. I mean, we're talking about things from fungal infections of the scalp and dermatitis on the scalp to thyroid issues and really stressful events leading to that short-term hair loss known as telogen effluvium. We also have things like pregnancy and nutritional deficiencies, which we'll cover briefly, but let's just get back to the main one, androgenic alopecia or androgenic hair loss.
He then mentioned some of the less common forms of hair loss, like telogen effluvium, which of course is stress-related hair loss due to triggering events from severe physical or psychological harm. And he also brings up hair loss from things like thyroid disease or nutritional deficiencies, but he doesn't get into too much depth with this, which is fine since these forms of hair loss are rare and aren't related to androgenic alopecia.
As the study put it, male androgenic alopecia is known as MAGA. That explains that.
MAGA! Or maybe they all had telogen effluvium since Trump got his ass kicked in the last election. Hell, it's been nearly a year. It's still most of them refuse to accept the reality that they lost. Although I imagine many of them are feeling a little bit better now since they won the gubernatorial election in the Commonwealth a few days ago.
But let's get to that main culprit here, which is the compound DHT or dihydrotestosterone.
So he then goes over DHT, and he gives a very easy-to-follow breakdown behind the mechanism of androgenic alopecia and how DHT is the androgen which causes the progression of androgenic alopecia in people who have the androgenic alopecia gene. He keeps it nice and simple here, which I like, because it's true. DHT is what causes androgenic alopecia, and if you want to stop your hair loss, you need to control the trash hormone DHT. I also like how he brings up how androgenic alopecia can affect women, because even though it is less common, it is definitely a real thing, and the causation of women is still related to androgens, even though women have lower androgen levels than men. Hair loss isn't as convoluted as a lot of people try to make it out to be. Yes, it is true there are a lot of downstream effects from DHT that involve other mechanisms like the WNT-Wnt pathway or prostaglandins or inflammation, but the triggering of these effects goes back to DHT, hence why the root cause and the weakest link in all the steps that occur in androgenic alopecia is DHT. So people who have androgenic alopecia don't need to waste their time speculating beyond the androgen mechanism behind hair loss, because it really is just as simple as attacking the weakest link in the process, meaning stopping DHT production, and I like how Mike gives us this simple explanation. Fighting hair loss is not some big enigma, and to his credit, even though he glosses over a few other concepts, I think he at least gets the big picture here.
And beyond hormones, there's a bit of a debate around how much blood flow plays a role. Either way, it's good to have adequate blood flow, and we've known for 30 years that men who have male pattern baldness have about 2.5 times lower blood flow to their scalp skin. The question becomes, was it some lower blood flow that led to that hair loss, or was it that you're not feeding so much hair anymore, you don't need as much blood flow to your scalp?
So he then brings up what he calls the blood flow theory, but in the scientific community it is actually known as the Bludflow theory, but he doesn't make any kind of definitive claims about this. Like many proponents of the Bludflow theory, he brings up the oft-quoted study that shows that there is lower blood flow in the scalp of balding men versus men with normal hair. To his credit, he does bring up the possibility that this reduced blood flow is the result and not the cause of androgen alopecia, but he quickly moves on without elaborating, so I'll go ahead and fill the void here for him. When you lose your hair, you're also going to lose the microvascular structures which support the hair follicles, which in turn will cause lower quantities of blood to be present in the scalp. Like I already said earlier, this is all instigated by DHT, which progressively shortens the anagen hair growth phase, miniaturizes the hair, and eventually replaces the hair follicles and the capillaries that supply blood to the hair follicles with scar tissue. Scar tissue is largely avascular and requires much less blood flow to survive compared to healthy skin with hair follicles, so when men go bald and their hair gets replaced with scar tissue, the result is that there is overall less blood supply to the scalp. So it's the hair loss that comes first, and then comes the decreased blood supply. It's not decreased blood flow that comes first, and then that is what causes hair loss. Blood flow isn't blocked off in the scalps of bald men to begin with. The vascular network that supplies blood to the scalp isn't obstructed, and also the vascular network is very redundant, meaning that even if one artery is constricted, the blood flow will just increase in the other arteries, and thus the overall blood supply will remain unchanged. I talk about this in my scalp massage video, which I'll link below, and it actually isn't even that controversial to begin with. There's just a lot of misinformation about it, but in terms of hard science, there isn't any quality data supporting the blood flow theory.
You have to know what is called Minoxidil, which is the active ingredient in Rogaine. It appears to be a vasodilator. That's why it became a hypertension or high blood pressure medicine initially. And so maybe it has to do with some blood flow, but we also know that it is a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor, or at least it downregulates the genes of 5-alpha reductase creation, according to this study.
He starts to talk about rosemary oil, but then realizes that in order to put rosemary oil into context, he first needs to talk about minoxidil. He brings up that minoxidil is a vasodilator, but it's actually not thought that vasodilation is the mechanism behind how minoxidil works. There are different theories about how minoxidil works, but its vasodilation effects don't play a role since no other vasodilator drugs affect hair growth. Like I already said, blood flow is not the problem, so increasing blood flow with minoxidil is not how it works, otherwise all blood pressure medications would work, and as I established earlier, bald men do not have restricted blood supply to the scalp, so wouldn't be a factor regardless. He mentions that minoxidil may affect the 5-AR enzyme, and he uses an in vitro study to support this. 5-alpha reductase is the enzyme that converts testosterone into DHT within the hair follicles, and blocking this enzyme is the way finasteride works. But as it turns out, there are a lot of natural finasteride wannabes out there that have some minimal 5-AR blocking abilities. In the study he quoted, the 5-AR gene expression was downregulated in minoxidil-treated culture hair keratinocyte cells, and the data here is interesting, but we are dealing with an in vitro study here, keep in mind. We're talking about tissue in a petri dish rather than live human subjects, and there has never been any clinical data to corroborate this 5-AR blocking effect of minoxidil. Logically speaking, it also doesn't make any sense whatsoever, because minoxidil when taken orally causes hypertrichosis, which is growth of hair all over the body. When it comes to body and facial hair, the response to DHT is quite a bit different than scalp hair because unlike scalp hair, DHT actually stimulates the growth of body and facial hair, hence where the term androgen paradox comes from. So if minoxidil's mechanism of action had anything to do with its 5-AR inhibiting abilities, its effects would only be localized on the scalp and not influence growth anywhere else on the body. In addition, minoxidil is effective in hair loss that is not related to androgen alopecia, so it acts more like a general growth stimulant than as an anti-androgen like finasteride. So I am skeptical that this anti-androgenic effect of minoxidil plays any significant role in how it works. If it exists at all, it's too minimal to be significant in any way.
So that is the baseline comparison here, at least for this study, this randomized control trial of 100 men with androgenic alopecia. They compared daily rosemary oil lotion to 2% minoxidil, and while nothing happened at the 3-month mark, things started happening at 6 months.
So having introduced minoxidil as an effective hair loss treatment, he circled back to the rosemary oil study that he wants to talk about. This is a study that I discussed in my previous video on the subject, which I'll go ahead and link below. But basically, what happens in the study is that the investigators took 100 men and randomly assigned 50 of them to use 2% minoxidil twice daily and 50 other men to use rosemary oil twice daily. And the men were followed for 6 months. Hair counts were done before treatment, after 3 months of treatment, and finally after 6 months of treatment. These hair counts were based on, quote, standardized professional microphotographic assessment, unquote. However, there is no mention of what part of the scalp was photographed or how many square centimeters were assessed, and that's potentially a big problem, especially if they use areas of the scalp that are more resistant to androgenic alopecia, like the occipital region of the scalp. There's also a problem with the study in that even before starting treatment, for whatever reason, the group randomized to minoxidil had better hair counts to start out with than those randomized to rosemary oil. After 3 months, there was no significant improvement in either group, though at 6 months, both the rosemary and minoxidil group showed improvement. Though looking at this graph from the paper here, there doesn't appear to be much change in either group over 6 months. The hair count changes were very minimal. The hair count in the rosemary group went from 123 to 30, which I assume is in units of hairs per square centimeter, though they don't say, and the hair count in the minoxidil group went 138 to 141, and again, we don't know what area of the scalp this represents, but I have to say, the results are pretty underwhelming, even in the minoxidil group. Of course, we have lots of other studies that show that minoxidil is effective, so we could probably just go ahead and consider this study to be an outlier for minoxidil, but in the case of rosemary oil, this is all we have as far as human studies, and this study shows results that are so underwhelming, they may just be due to random changes in the hair growth cycle. Remember, in clinical studies regarding hair loss treatments, it isn't uncommon to see even the placebo group get some improvements, so without a true placebo group, we can't determine if rosemary oil does anything at all, so I'm not impressed here. Now, the authors of the study also spend a lot of time saying how much scalp irritation was reduced with rosemary oil compared to minoxidil, but that's probably just because minoxidil is dissolved in ethanol, which might irritate the scalp in some people, but I really don't care about any of this because if rosemary oil doesn't work, then who cares about side effects? Pouring water on my scalp won't cause side effects either.
Which brings me to, are the Rogaine side effects really bad? Well, they don't seem to be super scary here, but one of them is increased hair loss. The studies demonstrate that you're going to be better off on average, but, those are at least side effects I'd rather not worry about having.
Well, Mike brings up the side effects of minoxidil, but these side effects are mild and rare. After all, the drug is sold over the counter. The increased hair loss he mentions as one of the side effects is just because of the initial shed that can occur when minoxidil shortens the telogen resting phase and transitions your hair follicles to the anagen growth phase. This shed is temporary, and pretty much any hair loss treatment that works will cause this kind of initial shedding. So if rosemary oil worked, it too would cause initial hair shedding, but that's not mentioned in the study on rosemary oil, so let's go ahead and try to move on here.
So how might rosemary be working? Well, in general, from this paper, rosemary has a bunch of properties like antioxidant, antibacterial, antifungal, anti-inflammatory, and also enhances microcapillary blood flow. So who knows if that plays a role?
Next, Mike the Vegan quotes some studies on rosemary oil that shows that rosemary oil is claimed to have antioxidant, antibacterial, antifungal, and anti-inflammatory properties. And again, trying to tie in the whole Bludflow theory, it may also increase capillary perfusion, but he doesn't give this too much credence. He does bring up a paper that shows that rosemary oil may have, you guessed it, some 5-AR blocking activity, but all this doesn't matter because we need some good outcome data, and the outcome data on rosemary oil is pretty meager as we've seen. I certainly don't think you can conclude from this one clinical study we have that rosemary oil is anywhere even remotely close to as good as minoxidil or even 2% minoxidil. He spends some time talking about using rosemary oil in a shampoo, and he shows how you can mix the stuff up yourself, but I wouldn't waste my time with any of that stuff since rosemary oil hasn't proven itself effective to begin with. But anyways, Mike the Vegan considers rosemary oil to be the big gun as far as herbal treatments for hair loss goes, so if this is the big gun, I guess things are only going downhill from here on. So let's see what's next in the top 4 vegan hair loss remedies that Mike the Vegan is promoting.
Next up is Rice, baby. You know we love rice on this channel. Anyway, there's a bunch of good information on just applying rice products to your skin. I might even do a whole video on that. But you might be familiar with that town in China that got the Guinness Book of World Records for having the longest hair. Well, they attribute that to their use of rice water, in particular fermented rice water.
So the next miracle cure is rice, or rice water, which supposedly is a secret to the town in China where people grow their hair out really long. But I suspect their true secret is that there are no barbers in the town. But anyways, Mike couldn't find any decent studies on rice water and hair growth, but he did find some data on using rice bran, which is not some breakfast cereal, but rather is made from the outer husk of the rice grains themselves.
This study that was funded by the South Korean government, they essentially administered that diluted rice bran extract to human hair.
So the first study he brings up on rice bran is from Good Korea and was done on cultured human hair papilla cells. This is a pretty recent study, being from 2017, and they're looking at what is hot right now, which is the WNT or Wnt pathway, because the Wnt pathway seems to be inhibited by DHT, and when the Wnt pathway is stimulated, it causes hair to enter and maintain the anagen growth phase. So Mike glosses over the Wnt pathway aspects of the study, but shows in a graph that rice bran stimulates collagen growth and decreases interleukin-1 alpha, which is a negative hair growth factor. But the study also showed that rice bran stimulated the beta-catenin, which is a marker of the Wnt pathway. So overall, this is an interesting study that suggests rice bran or something in rice bran might actually stimulate hair growth. But again, this is just an in vitro study, and Mike admits that we need more than this to recommend using rice bran as a hair tonic.
Thankfully, we have another study, which is actually a randomized control trial in entire humans, not just a petri dish. It was also funded by the Korean government, so they had some interest here.
Well, as it turns out, Mike found another study from Good Korea on rice bran, and this is actually a human study from 2015 that looked at the effect of rice bran extract on androgen alopecia. So this study was done before the in vitro study we just talked about, and in 2015 when the study was published, the theory was that rice bran was, you guessed it, a 5-AR inhibitor based on some earlier mouse studies. So anyways, this human study was a 16-week double-blind placebo-controlled study comparing topical rice bran extract to a placebo. The investigators used a phototrichogram to assess hair counts, which is felt by most researchers to be the most reliable and accurate way to count hairs and judge parameters like hair thickness. There were 50 subjects with androgen alopecia, 28 men and 22 women, and half of them applied 4 milliliters of rice bran solution to their scalp once or twice a day, and the other half used just the placebo. Subjects were assessed with the phototrichograms at baseline and then after 8 and then 16 weeks. So this sounds like a pretty good study design, so what were the results? Well, first of all, out of the original 50 subjects, 7 dropped out of the study, so we are left with 43 subjects. Well, that's a little disappointing, but these things happen. So what were the results with these 43 subjects? Well, unfortunately, you're never going to find out the results in those 43 subjects in this paper because the authors decide to break down the results by the sex of the subjects. This might not seem like a big deal after all. I mean, maybe androgen alopecia behaves differently in men compared to women, and it's not unusual to do subgroup analyses in clinical studies, like looking at results based on sex or age or Norwood classification. It is, though, very unusual not to even publish the overall group effect first, and I'm sure the reason the authors didn't publish the overall results was because the overall results did not show a benefit to rice bran extract versus placebo. Looking at the results by sex, they did find that there was an increase in hair density in men after 16 weeks of therapy, but there was no increase in hair density in women after 16 weeks. So the two results probably canceled each other out in the overall group, which is why the researchers didn't report the overall results. With hair density, there were improvements at 16 weeks for both men and women when compared to the diameter at 8 weeks, but not when compared to the baseline diameter. It is interesting to see that in the placebo group, both hair density and hair diameter improved with no treatment, which shows why having a placebo control is so important in these studies. Due to hair cycling or possibly just due to some poorly understood placebo effect, improving hair counts can occur in studies of hair treatments, and these improvements may not be due to the treatment at all, just placebo. So Mike notes the fact that the results were better in men, but not in women, and he attributes this lack of change in women to the good growth from just placebo alone in the women on placebo, but the bottom line is that there was no benefit in the group as a whole, and the only effect was seen in the 22 men who completed the study, of whom there were only 9 on rice bran and 13 on placebo. So any significant results from the study just came from 9 men, and I think these results are as likely to be by chance as from any effect from rice bran. So while I find the possible Wnt pathway effects of rice bran interesting, we simply don't have the clinical data to recommend its use at this point.
Anyway, here's a pretty compelling before and after of a male subject from this study. I will say it looks like they zoomed out a little bit, making that spot look a little bit smaller anyway, but still there is an increase in hair growth, apparently.
So Mike shows some before and after pictures from the rice bran study, but I like the way he is somewhat skeptical here, because changes in zoom or scale or lighting are common techniques used by a lot of hairline fraud cells to sell their products. So anyways, we're done with rice bran, so let's go ahead and move on to vegan hair miracle cure number 3, which is...
All right, next up we have saw palmetto extract. This is from the berry of this little dwarf tree that grows in the southeastern United States. And yeah, there seems to be quite a few studies, and thankfully there's a review that looked at all of the best ones. They looked at 5 randomized control trials and a couple other studies, mostly for androgenic alopecia. We're talking oral or topical application, and quote, 60% improvement in overall hair quality, 27% improvement in total hair count, increased hair density in 83.3% of patients, and stabilized disease progression among 52% were noted.
So I've not done a full video on saw palmetto, but I did discuss it in one of my hair guard videos, which I'll link below. He first mentions a review article on saw palmetto, which looked at the results of 5 studies based on saw palmetto. But due to the fact that these were small studies, Mike notes that the authors of this article say,
that being said, because a lot of the studies weren't very big, and for other statistical reasons, they say that these results should be taken with caution.
So he then brings up a randomized study comparing saw palmetto to finasteride, or as he puts it,
a comparison between saw palmetto extract and finasteride / Propecia.
And these drugs, finasteride and dutasteride or dutasteride, whatever you want to pronounce it.
Well, I have nothing to complain about with this study. In the study of 100 patients randomized to 1 milligram of finasteride daily versus 320 milligrams daily of Serenoa repens, which is saw palmetto, finasteride turned out to be better than saw palmetto, and only 38% of patients had improvement with saw palmetto versus 68% treated with finasteride. Also, saw palmetto only helped on the vertex, while finasteride was useful all over the scalp pretty much. Since the study lacked a true control group though, we don't know for sure if saw palmetto had any real effect at all. But even if it did, finasteride was better. So what would be the advantage of taking saw palmetto over finasteride, you have to wonder?
They generally don't want a loss of interest in sex when they're trying to regrow their hair. I mean, when your whole goal is to attract a mate by increasing your plumage, you don't want things to go like, I've been grooming my hair for months, and now that I've got you in the bedroom, maybe we should just talk. How about my beautiful hair?
I'm leaving.
Well, what he should be talking about here is not the side effects of finasteride, but the side effects of not taking finasteride. Here, I'll go ahead and show you.
Welcome to the show, sir. Take it away and give it your best shots.
Hello, lady. My name is Amos, and I'm from Roscommon.
Tell us, are you turned on or turned off?
Shocking.
Ooh.
No, I'm not.
Shannon, lights off for you as well. I'm doing my best for you here.
It's just the hair, the lack of, I'm sorry.
Nadine, what happened?
He kind of looks a bit old, and he's baldy like me dad, and no.
Okay.
Damn feminazis and SJWs are making everything too woke. I'm going to read some Sam Harris, listen to some Dragon Force, and then watch some Neon Genesis Evangelion because nobody understands Hideaki Anno's genius like I do. So if you don't use finasteride, then forget the bedroom. You won't even make it past the dating app on your phone without getting left swipe. Oh, and just to be fair and give both sides of the argument, let's see. Jason Statham, The Rock, Vin Diesel, Bruce Willis, blah, blah, blah. Let's move on to magical vegan hair loss remedy number 4.
And next up, we have pink and blue ginger.
Okay then, multicolored ginger. So this is related to turmeric and is yet another 5-AR inhibitor, at least supposedly. So there are a lot of these natural remedies out there that are 5-AR blockers, and I talked about one of them in my last video with reishi mushrooms, but the big problem with a lot of these natural 5-AR inhibitors is that they are a lot weaker than finasteride, and probably none of them even work.
And that brings me to this study in a random Thai journal, which I will have you know is officially a tier 1 journal, says right there.
But anyways, Mike digs up a study about pink and blue ginger, and he notes it's from a Thai hair journal. Other than the abstract being in English, the entire study is written in the Thai language. So the abstract states that the ratio of miniaturized vellus to normal hairs was reduced with the curcuma, turmeric, ginger versus 5% minoxidil after 12 weeks of treatment. But otherwise, there was no difference between the outcomes, and this was in 24 men with androgen alopecia. But you got me here, Mike. I don't speak Thai, so I can't really analyze the study as to its methodology.
No, so take that finding as what you will, and I love this picture. It's the before and after, but like, come on, look at the brightness difference on those. Like, come on, scientists, you gotta be a little sneakier than that.
Even Mike is not convinced by the before and after pictures in the study, but damn would you have to be either really brave or really stupid to trust your hair to ginger based on a study as low quality as this one. Well, thankfully, he finds another study on curcuma, and this one is completely in English this time, and here the researchers looked at 87 men with androgenic alopecia, and these men were randomized to receive either a placebo, curcuma, 5% minoxidil, or the combination of 5% minoxidil plus curcuma for a period of 6 months. This study is also from Thailand, so I guess that's where you can pick up pink and blue ginger from. But anyways, when they looked at hair counts, all 4 groups, including the placebo group, had increases in their hair counts over 6 months as seen here. But these changes were not statistically significant. However, when overall photos were looked at and judged by the investigators, they felt that the combination of minoxidil and curcuma, as well as minoxidil alone, had a statistically significant improvement, but the improvement from curcuma alone did not reach statistical significance. So who knows, maybe there is some weak evidence here of a synergistic effect between curcuma and minoxidil, but as Mike himself points out, once again, the photos that led to this conclusion appear a little misleading. As Mike says,
they also have another before and after, which, you know, maybe the hair was just longer, maybe it's actually better. I don't know. They're pulling out all the stops for these pictures.
Well, after all that, Mike says he can't even find pink and blue ginger online, so if you are convinced by these studies, you better go ahead and plan a trip to Thailand to pick some up. So that's it. 4 plant-based treatments for hair loss. Are we done?
All right, we have an honorable mention here that is clearly lacking data, but we have a study on green tea. They took the active ingredient, and yeah, it increased human hair growth in a petri dish.
Well, no, not quite, because green tea gets an honorable mention here, and it's based on an in vitro study, and Mike says we're lacking data here, but I think I could say that about all the plant-based substances he's mentioned so far in his video. Anyways, he brings the study up kind of just jokingly as an aside, and I think I'll dismiss it as well since we have not had any clinical trials on green tea for hair growth, at least none that I'm aware of. But if we're going to take an in vitro study seriously, then here is something else to consider about green tea for hair loss. There's another mouse study that shows that green tea actually increases DHT levels, as you can see in this graph here, where the green tea bar is highlighted in green. The same graph also shows black tea lowers DHT levels, but this is just an example of cherry-picking data that fits his argument, and this is the problem because without further analysis, someone who is new to the good fight against hair loss may walk away from Mike's video concluding that green tea may actually help, even though there is contradictory data in the literature, and the data is based on a weak foundation to begin with just mouse studies. So with that said, Mike goes ahead and wraps things up, and he also provides some Amazon affiliate links to the products he mentioned in the video, so I guess he still feels confident enough in what he's promoting to cash in on it, even if it's not that much money. So overall, this actually is not a bad video, and I do give Mike the Vegan credit for showing his due criticism of the research, including pointing out the dubious before and after pictures, which clearly showed different lighting and angling. But what I did find disappointing, though, is that Mike the Vegan didn't take a more pro-finasteride stance, and when he did mention it, he decided to fearmonger about it by acting like the small risk of side effects was a major concern when the clinical research clearly shows the risks are very minimal. Furthermore, I think he should have been more open to the idea that vegans should use finasteride because ultimately, if we want to be good representatives of an ethical movement, it is important we leave a good first impression. Mike himself said that a vegan's veganism will be used against them every time something bad happens to them, and whether that is fair or not, it is true. If a vegan is bald, people will jump to the conclusion that this person person is bald because they are vegan. Vegans can go ahead and try to dissuade people from believing this, but a much easier option would be not to give them an excuse to believe this in the first place. So, as an advocate for an important ethical movement, it is important we not just speak logically, but also look the part. There are a lot of 5-AR blockers out there that exist in nature, like saw palmetto, reishi mushroom, stinging nettle root, and rosemary oil, but the problem with all these natural 5-AR inhibitors is that they are all complete weak sauce compared to the pharmacological agents that were developed specifically to block the 5-AR enzyme, like finasteride. Just because something has a mechanism which makes sense doesn't mean it will translate into any kind of worthwhile outcomes for fighting androgenic alopecia. Finasteride may have some superficial similarities to these natural treatments, but it is much, much stronger and will actually work. So if you want to stop hair loss, you should use finasteride, not its weaker natural cousins. Just because they're natural doesn't mean they're any better or any safer, and if these natural treatments were strong enough to do anything, then they'd have a side effect profile too, so there's no point in trying to find a natural means of fighting hair loss. It simply will not work. So vegans should really stop trying to be so anti-pharmaceutical and believing that nutrition is the answer to every health problem. This is similar to the approach of a lot of anti-vegans like Dr. Paul Saladino, as well as the Ray Peat forums, who act like treating hair loss is simply a matter of just getting the right foods in your diet. Vegans should hold themselves to a higher standard than the bro scientists who like to criticize veganism. Thinking you can regrow your hair by eating organ meats is the same as thinking you can regrow your hair by eating pink and blue ginger or by taking a daily aspirin. To be fair though, I am not saying Mike the Vegan is as bad as the Ray Peat forums, because at least Mike doesn't deny that DHT causes hair loss, and he does show some good skepticism in the research he presents. But in general, people who believe in plant-based hair loss cures are just giving ammunition to carnists and anti-vegans, because if you say things that are really far-fetched, then they'll easily debunk them and then use that as an excuse to debunk veganism overall by saying the proponents of the movement are not credible. Finasteride, it is a great treatment that is safe and effective whether you are a vegan or not. Mike the Vegan's audience, I imagine, is mostly vegan, so I think by fear-mongering about finasteride while promoting these unvalidated natural alternatives, he's really putting his viewers at risk of losing the good fight against hair loss, and ultimately that is going to lead to a lot more animal suffering, because people are going to be less likely to listen to a vegan activist who is bald rather than a vegan activist who has a full head of hair. Being a good salesperson for anything, whether it be a product or an ideology, will always be bolstered if the person presenting it gives a good first impression, and what better way to leave a good first impression than by having a full head of hair? That's not going to happen if you rely on witch doctor woo hair loss treatments like rosemary oil and green tea and rice bran extract. It's only going to happen if you rely on the treatments that are clinically proven to work, and the best ones out there are finasteride and minoxidil. The last thing veganism needs is more bald vegans. Now, another point I want to bring up that Mike the Vegan doesn't go over is that I know there are a lot of vegans out there who will bring up the presence of lactose in finasteride tablets, and it is true. Finasteride tablets do have a trace amount of lactose in them, but when I say a trace amount, I mean the amount is beyond trivial. To give you an example of just how low the amount of lactose is in a tablet of finasteride, let's go ahead and do some math. An average glass of milk has anywhere between 9 to 14 grams of lactose. A 5 milligram Proscar tablet has 97.5 milligrams of lactose in it. So a full Proscar tablet has about 1/100th of the amount of lactose in a glass of milk. However, people who take Proscar for hair loss will typically quarter the pills into 1.25 milligram pieces, which means that a daily dose of finasteride is only 1/400th of an 8-ounce glass of milk, which means that even after a year of daily finasteride consumption, your average person will not even have consumed a single glass of milk. In fact, the dose of lactose in finasteride is so low, even people who are lactose intolerant can take it. Now, I know that some vegans will be so puritanical that they'll declare that even this trace amount of lactose is absolutely unacceptable, but just think about that stance for a moment. Almost everything you eat that is prepared somewhere is going to be prepared in some area that has some cross-contamination, and considering just how low the level of lactose is in finasteride, there is a good chance your average vegan inadvertently consumes more dairy just through their food being on shared food equipment. equipment. So it is true, vegans should not consume dairy, not even in small amounts, but there is a difference between a small amount and a trivial amount, and the amount of dairy found in finasteride is so trivial that it is possible for a non-vegan to consume more dairy in a day than the amount of dairy a vegan would consume over a lifetime of finasteride use. Now, if you're going to be extremely strict, it is possible to have finasteride compounded without dairy at a compounding pharmacy, although this will be more expensive than just buying generic Proscar, for instance. Also, keep in mind that the lactose being used in Proscar is simply just a byproduct of the dairy industry, so it's not like cows are being abused specifically to create finasteride, and the amount of dairy found in finasteride isn't enough for it to be profitable for the dairy industry, so you're not betraying your values as a vegan by using Proscar or finasteride or Propecia. So rather than thinking about the minuscule amount of lactose found in finasteride, think about the animals you will be saving by being a more presentable advocate for veganism by having a full head of hair. If Mike the Vegan ever does go bald, people will use this video he made against him by claiming that veganism is bad for your hair, and as unfair and inaccurate as that claim may be, there are sadly people who will believe it because ultimately, when it comes to messaging, it isn't always about what is true, but just what people believe. There are plenty of merits about veganism that stand well enough on their own without having to dip our toes into the realm of pseudoscience. Leave the nutritional bro science to the bone broth slurping Karens and aspirin popping conspiracy theorists. Let's stick with the actual science so that if people do go vegan, they do so for sincere reasons based on science and not because they have been misled about the purported health benefits of veganism. Otherwise, we have nobody but ourselves to blame for the proliferation of more ex-vegans. So overall, I enjoyed Mike's video and his humor style, and I like everything he has done to defend the rights of animals, but I do hope that if he addresses hair loss in the future, he will apply the same quality research he has done on veganism towards hair loss. Anyways, with that, I think it's time to Delta, so good luck on the path, my fellow hair loss witchers, and take care.